Welcome to the first episode in a Legendarium series called the Mycenaeans. In this episode, Lords of the Stone Palaces, we will talk about how the first humans to settle in Greece brought Neolithic farming to southern Europe. However, the advent of bronze working transformed Stone Age village chieftains into Bronze Age kings who ruled small states from vast stone palaces. When we think of ancient Greece, the Trojan War often comes to mind. Yet if the Trojan War did take place, it was almost certainly fought not by the classical Greeks, but by the ancestors they looked to for inspiration and heroic role models, now called the Mycenaeans. While regarded as a minor power in their time compared to Egypt, the Mycenaeans built vast palace complexes, presided over tightly controlled states, and became part of a trade network that stretched to Thebes, Babylon, and even the mountains of Afghanistan. Around 10,000 years ago, a period of climate stabilization began, which made it possible for human beings to make the change from hunting to farming. This dramatic change in daily life came to Greece around 6800 BC, when farming peoples in what is today Turkey faced problems stemming from overpopulation. So they made their way into Europe, traveling across the Black Sea into what would become Thrace, or modern-day Bulgaria. Others may have slowly traveled from one island in the Aegean Sea to another until they finally reached Greece. Wherever they found a steady source of water from rivers or springs, they settled. Most of them lived in one-room houses measuring about 100 square feet. In a single room, women cooked, men worked on their tools, and sometimes they buried the dead in the earthen floors of their houses. Other people wove sticks together to make timber fences and then covered those fences with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal feces that hardened in the sun. But they didn't just build houses, they also brought barley seeds and domestic cattle. These Neolithic farmers, working with flint tools, reshaped the landscape to suit their needs, creating vast pastures by building stone walls that could stretch for miles and then filling them with sheep and goats, while growing barley wherever they could. These early farmers baked bread over fires, sometimes boiling oats in water to make something that resembled porridge. From goat milk, they made dairy products similar to modern cottage cheese. To store their grains and cheese, they made pottery and painted it red and white. Most of these early Greeks worshipped a nameless pantheon of nature gods, seeing a divine hand in everything, from thunderclaps to the changing of the seasons. The first Greeks made offerings in the form of clay tablets and birds left in caves to the gods. They also took special care in burying the dead, placing goods that the dead would need in the next world within their tombs. These first Greeks tended to create small farming communities among the mountain valleys. This helped to ensure that Greece would remain politically fragmented, with communities too isolated from one another for a single conqueror to impose his rule upon all of them, in stark contrast to Mesopotamia and Egypt, ruled by emperors and kings. In the later years of the Neolithic, trade networks began to spring up. Greece included the island of Milos, where early explorers found volcanic glass called obsidian, which proved even stronger than flint. Early traders in wickerwork boats covered with hides, often powered by oars, made their way to this prized island to trade obsidian. But soon they discovered new islands and more countries with more trade goods. Some of these early traders almost certainly came from the great island of Crete, where farmers and fishermen began trading their surplus with peoples in Europe and Asia. Sometime around 2000 BC, the Cretians likely discovered bronze working in Asia. Bronze working was nothing less than a revolution in technology at the time. Copper working had been around since 4000 BC, but copper by itself isn't much harder than flint. But when combined with tin, copper produces a new alloy called bronze, which can be used to make more beautiful and stronger things than ever seen before. And bronze working would prove a boon, especially to the chieftains who sought to impose their rule upon others. To be sure, the populace of Neolithic farming communities always held their chieftains in great reverence. Indeed, in some parts of Europe, chieftains received a special burial by cremation, while ordinary people were interred in the earth. However, violent conflict in an age of stone-tipped arrows gave chieftains little chance to expand their domains through violent conflict. But after the advent of bronze making, it became possible to make not only bronze versions of axes and daggers, but helmets, breastplates, and greaves, which made it possible for warriors to survive a battle. And the more warriors that a chief could equip with bronze weapons and armor, the more land he could take. In generations to come, Neolithic chieftains transformed into Bronze Age kings. Many of the power centers of this emerging culture later featured in Greek mythology. For example, Pylos was said to be the home of the great champion Nestor. A more famous example teaches that Perseus originally founded the city of Mycenae after slaying the fearsome Medusa. Perseus founded the Perseid dynasty to rule his city of Mycenae, which only ended with the cowardly Eurystheus, who sent Hercules on his legendary 12 labors. Eurystheus disgraced himself and his dynasty by repeatedly hiding in a clay amphorae when Hercules time and again dragged legendary beasts into his hall. After the fall of Eurystheus, the Atreid dynasty took power, with Agamemnon serving as the most famous Atreid king. Of course, according to the Iliad, Agamemnon led the cities of Greece in their 10-year campaign against the city of Troy to retake the wife of his brother Menelaus. Of course, it is also possible to see these connections to Greek mythology as Bronze Age monarchs trying to establish a grander history not only for their cities, but for their families, and thus firmly establishing their right to rule in the minds of their subjects. Other royal seats from the era included cities that would become prominent during the later classical era, beginning in 800 BC, like Thebes, Argos, Sparta, and possibly even Athens. At a glance, these Greek palace-states shared a common culture. They used similar architecture, pottery, jewelry, and weaponry. For writing, most of these so-called Mycenaean states adopted the Linear B script, itself an adaptation of the Linear A script that came from Crete. They likely differed mainly in the various dialects of the Greek language that they spoke. However, their intense loyalty to their respective kings and the warrior code which pervaded much of Greece ensured that violent conflict between these small states would remain common, whether they shared a common culture or not. Mycenaean civilization took its name from the Bronze Age city of Mycenae. Human beings first settled the site around 2100 BC, building the first walls, creating the first pottery, and digging the first tombs in the area. Mycenae was located between two hills on the Argolid plain of the Peloponnese, enjoying a strategic location on a rocky hill about 150 feet high, which provided a commanding view of the surrounding plain. Guards could see 8 miles, an obvious advantage. From 1600 BC onwards, it became a residence for the ruling elite and included the famed Tholos tomb called the Treasury of Atreus, a great circular building with a core-belled roof. It was 45 feet in diameter, and those entering had to march through a long, unroofed corridor about 100 feet long and 20 feet wide. Mycenaean kings also created fortified walls of uncut stone blocks, roads, dams, and trade contacts with the Minoans on Crete. The Mycenaean fortress endured until the late 13th century BC, when it was likely destroyed by an earthquake. It was partially rebuilt, but was abandoned for good during the Great Collapse of the Late Bronze Age. While we call this warlike culture dominated by warrior kings the Mycenaeans, the term would have been wholly unknown in that time and place, except as it applied to the city-state of Mycenae. Indeed, the classical Greek writers who described this era referred not to Mycenaeans, but to specific tribes, such as the Achaeans and the Argives. Indeed, the Iliad referred to the Greek fighters who traveled to Troy by the thousands, not as the Greeks, but as the Achaeans. In a sign of just how common war was in the society, many graves included spears, javelins, swords, and helmets made of bronze to accompany fighting men into the afterlife. Small wonder that the classical Greeks would later recall this as a heroic age of great warriors. The palace centers ruled by local kings, not surprisingly, became the basis of political power. Mycenaean society was organized along lines similar to medieval feudalism, with a king and a warrior aristocracy supported by large numbers of peasant villagers. These palaces also served as economic centers for their kingdom. Every sheaf of grain and every cow in the kingdom would be brought in, tallied, and counted. Vast stores of grain and wine and oil would be kept in the palaces and distributed to the army or to needy villages as the king saw fit. The king kept his rule with the support of a warrior aristocracy who made up the core of his army. Most of the aristocrats were chariot archers, and most likely they fought with the hope of gaining new land, which meant greater wealth and status. And we will talk about the Mycenaean war machine in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Legendarium. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.